Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome to an amazing Zoom conversation at the Usuli Institute. For those of you who are joining us who may not be aware, the Usuli Institute is a 501c3 education institute dedicated to elevating ethics and critical thinking, beauty and humanism in the Islamic tradition. We have recently completed an entire tafsir with our founder, Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl, where we did deep dives into every single chapter of the Quran to elicit the moral lessons that we could apply to our time, which obviously is extremely important at this stage. We are really honored and blessed to be in conversation tonight with Professor Khaled Beydoun, and also our superstar, of course, Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl, and our superstar in our community here, Jana Al-Akhras, who is a immigration attorney and very active on the Palestine activist front. Her family is from Palestine. We've done a lot of programming here at the Usuli Institute, where Jana has also shared her family history and her activism. So we have a lot of really important content for people who want to delve a little deeper into what's been happening in Palestine and law and all of that. Which brings us to our very important conversation tonight with Professor Beydoun. First of all, I'm so excited because Professor Beydoun joined us many years ago when we started the Usuli Institute, when we were back in Los Angeles. We had a fabulous conversation on CVE, which was a very controversial issue between him and Salam Al-Mariyati of MPAC. And I'm proud to say that they are now friends, and I've seen beautiful pictures as proof. So we brought them together. Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl, moderated that conversation, which got a little dicey at times, but it was great. So, and also there's, a history. Actually, Professor Beydoun was a student back at UCLA Law, and so we go back quite a ways. But we're so honored and blessed to have this conversation tonight. I know those of us who have been glued to our social media to try and understand what's happening on the ground in Palestine and elsewhere in the Muslim world, all of us follow Professor Beydoun, and we are really grateful. It is really difficult work. It's tireless. I really am dying to know more about how you stay on the front line, how you keep your head above water, how you stay sane. Because on the one hand, he is our lifeline to understanding what's happening, across the world. But at the same time, he is also dealing with a lot of his own difficulty. He is the author of two important books on Islamophobia. The newest book is called New Crusades, the Global War on Muslims. And he's a law professor at Arizona State University. So there's a lot obviously going on the academic front. A lot of people understand this is a hard time for people who are speaking truth to power and on the side of Palestine. So I'm hoping that we have an opportunity really to kind of step into Professor Beydoun's world and really educate ourselves on what's happening on a lot of fronts. So thank you so much for joining us. And maybe just to start this conversation, I mentioned to you, I would ask you, your life was one way before October 7th. You were already very engaged with the issues, around Islamophobia, but I'm sure all of that exploded, everything changed. I thought maybe you could just share with us what your life was like pre-October 7th and then what's been happening since then. So thank you so much.
No, thank you so much, Sister Grace. And it's always it feels like I'm back with family when I'm with you and Professor Khaled Abou El Fadl. In many ways, it doesn't feel like a long time ago when I was a Professor Khaled Abou El Fadl's student. And he's one of the many people who inspired me to pursue legal academia. So it's a beautiful experience to be back, full circle with you guys to have this conversation. So I think after October 7th, like my life has been kind of a whirlwind, largely because of I had an active and sort of like present social media voice beforehand, discussing what was taking place around the world. Obviously October 7th happened, and just seeing the real-time images, videos, having relationships with people on the ground in Gaza, having friendships with people who've been killed in South Lebanon since the beginning of the crisis. A friend of mine, journalist Issam Abdallah, was killed by targeted assassination a week into the crisis. Just sort of like layers of direct personal connections to what's taking place on the ground, but also obviously given the work that I do, intellectual connections that I really felt as if I had no choice. It wasn't even like a natural kind of rational decision to speak up. It just kind of happened from a very guttural standpoint, and it's been happening since. That's the best way to sort of describe it.
So feel free at any point if Dr. Khaled and Jana, if you want to join in or if you have a question. Thank you. And I'm so sorry. I mean, I know that there's so many people that have lost people that they love over there. I and wanted to ask you, you've been so active. Oftentimes the news that that you share across Instagram is the first that we hear of what's happening. Where do you get your news?
Mm.
And also, well, let's start with that. I mean, how do you spend your time gathering that and sharing it?
I think because of the relationships that I'd forged before this crisis, I've been vocal on Palestine for my entire lifetime. I mean, to be honest with you, so I've forged really important relationships with journalists, with lay people on the ground, developed sort of connections with individuals who live there, who follow me and I follow back. So the very first thing that happened was I remember just sort of a rush of content was being sent to me from people on the ground, who wanted me to share and amplify it because I developed this platform. Some of it was just innocuous information as to what was taking place with their lives, the fact that they didn't have access to clean water. Some of it was as gruesome and graphic as videos of young babies being, sort of disfigured and mutilated into unknowable piles of blood and bone. I'd seen it all, and I still get videos and photos of that kind from people on the ground. So that's the primary source of news that I get. I'm also, I try to, ferret out information from a wide cross section of sources, whether it's liberal, Israeli media, or you can't even call it liberal anymore because it's shifted since the beginning of this crisis. Palestinian media like Al-Quds News. I follow Al Jazeera Arabi really closely because the content that they share is dramatically different than Al Jazeera English, but also American sources, and also individuals that I trust on social media. So it's that entire cross section of authority that I try to pull from, but primarily people on the ground who are sharing direct testimony and content about what they see on a daily basis.
So as of today, I mean, I was checking in with Democracy Now! On the latest numbers that they were reporting. Of course, minute by minute, the numbers increase and, the pictures become more and more gruesome. But as of what Democracy Now! Is reporting, there's, 20,000 and upwards killed, 50,000 upwards injured. That of the 2.3 million people living in Gaza, I think it's something like half of them are starving. And 9 out of 10 people are not eating enough, and they don't know where their next meal will come from. Certainly, I know this week there were some incredibly gruesome pictures and stories. People who were killed in the school, people, men who have been, Palestinian men who've been paraded with no clothes on. It just seems like you can't get any worse, and then it does. I'm just wondering, one, how do you deal with all of that horrible content that you're dealing with? Because I'm sure you feel probably, you can't turn your eyes away from any of it. And secondly, just, your reaction. It's now been over 2 months and things are not getting better. People are not listening. What is the message that you are trying to convey to people when you're putting, all of your stuff out on social media?
Yeah, I think so. That's a really interesting question. And the way I think about that is that I think of myself as a conduit for other people more so than the actual principal messenger, if that makes any sense. Right. So for me, being an educator and being a law professor, one thing that I've always, sort of tried to do since the beginning of my career is to translate the academic work that we do and make it digestible and palatable for a general and lay audience, and that's why social media is so powerful, right? And that's also true with the content, the testimony that I get from people on the ground. Is I try to, translate it in a way and add wording that makes it understandable and accessible for a general audience here in the United States, but also globally. But yeah, but I think the general message is, and look, you shared some of the statistics around the genocide, right? I think that the number dead is far higher, to be honest with you. Like for me, I always mesh or merge the number of people that are officially reportedly dead with the number of people that are missing. Look, in my I look, so I was born into war. Like we can talk about that maybe in a bit. Like my childhood, I spent much of it in war-torn Lebanon. So whenever they share that people are missing for more than 24 or 48 hours, 85% of those missing folks are dead, right? So I think it's smart to merge the number of missing with the number of people dead. And I think the number of people dead is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of like 25,000 people, to be honest with you. Remember that Gaza, even before the thinning out of Gaza, as Netanyahu calls it, was the second or third most concentrated place in the world beyond population. And Israel has used, this figure was just released by CNN yesterday, 50% of their aerial munitions were dumb bombs, which means that when you drop them, they're misguided and directionless. They bring about collateral and collective punishment. And they use dumb bombs intentionally because that was their objective, right? But yeah, that's my central message, is to be a conduit for other people. And then second, it's so you coupled the question with how do I get through it? Again, a lot of this war, to be honest with you, is nostalgic but present in a very sort of blurred way because of my childhood in Lebanon during the Civil War. My father lost his business to Israeli war jets that bombed his business. So my earliest memories as a kid were, again, like sirens signaling that an encroaching military was coming, the sound of aerial jets flying above our building. I'll be frank, like the image that we see of Gaza, like these shattered buildings and the gray rubble, that reminded me of the Beirut that I was growing up in. So there's something deeply personal about what's taking place right now.
Absolutely. And, I think we cannot help but look at these images and just think, what the heck do we do? What do we, like, I know a lot of people are protesting, a lot of people are doing whatever they can, and yet they feel, very helpless. And the good thing, I guess, is too, there are a lot of people who didn't pay attention to this issue before now joining the fray. So, you've got a lot of people who are not Muslim. They're not, they're the ethical people that really cannot stand what they're seeing. And that, here in America, our taxpayer dollars are going to fund that. And yet at the same time, we here in America probably have the most freedom and ability to affect change. And I'm just wondering, what you've seen from where you're sitting, if things have moved, what your thoughts are on the outlook of
Yeah.
change.
Yeah, so there's political outlook, which, to be honest with you, is very harrowing. But then there's also sort of a outlook tied to where the trajectory of how people feel is going. And I think that's promising. I can't recollect a moment in my life, and I've been vocal and active on this issue since I was born, basically, where there's been this sort of like popular upswell of pro-Palestinian sentiment, not only in the United States but globally, and it's diverse. The coalition is intersectional. People who are afraid to speak up before are finally now speaking up, and I think that speaks to the degree and severity of horror that they're seeing on the ground and that they're seeing on television and across their digital timelines. So that makes me really optimistic, especially amongst young demographics who are fearless in ways that people at my age were fearful when I was in law school. Like I remember when I was at UCLA trying to talk to folks about this issue, nobody wanted to hear any of it. Even progressive people, and I was a critical race, Professor Khaled knows, I was in the critical race studies department. That's the most progressive people. This issue got no ears. Nobody wanted to talk about this. And that's changed dramatically, and that makes me very optimistic. What makes me pessimistic is, even though you have this sort of progressive sway towards pro-Palestinian sentiment at the grassroots level, at the very sort of at the high governmental level, in this country, it's still staunchly pro-Israel, and we see that through, again, the carte blanche that the Biden administration has given to the Netanyahu regime to, unleashed, unhinged, genocidal violence with full-fledged impunity over the course of 70 days. Today's the 70-day mark of this genocide. In the United States, we saw what happened at the United Nations Security Council. We saw the referendum against the United States and Israel at the United Nations General Assembly a couple of days ago, that even if the world stands against the United States and Israel to the tune of 153 votes to 10, it doesn't matter unless the United States decides to change its tune.
Right. Go ahead,
Um,
please.
there are so there's so many, and I want to pull Jana into this conversation as well. There are so many. For me, I mean, this has to be a turning point, and we can. There's several categories that I'd like to pick your brain on. The Muslim response and what the implications are for the very idea of an ummah going forward. I mean, I know Jana is Palestinian. Are you Palestinian? Or
No, so my great grandfather was Palestinian.
so are you Lebanese by
I'm
citizen?
I'm I'm primarily Lebanese and Egyptian, like you.
Oh.
My mother's
I'm sorry.
my mother's Masri, and my father, Allah yarhamu, was from South Lebanon, from a village called Bint Jbel, which is right at the border of Palestine, and his grandfather was Palestinian.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's I actually should have remembered that, but that you're half Egyptian. But okay, it is. I don't know. I don't have the word, but the entire Muslim world only works through the relatively impotent institutions of the United Nations.
Yeah.
And outside the United Nations, the Muslim world is unable to even, I mean, just so we're clear, every rule of international law, rules against extrajudicial killings violated, rules against targeting civilians violated, rules against targeting UN personnel and UN officials violated. Every conceivable rule within the Geneva Convention, but even beyond the Geneva Convention, every international, I can't think of an international human rights treaty that has not been violated.
Mm.
And the impotence of the Muslim Ummah is just stunning.
Yeah.
How do you, I mean, you're a Muslim professor, Jen is a Muslim lawyer.
Yeah.
How do you think of your Muslim brethren and sisters? How do you, I mean, if it seems to me just obscene if after this is back to business as usual, if we just go back to the issue being whether men and women are separated with a proper curtain in a mosque, and whether there's an entrance for women and an entrance for men. I mean, it just seems to me obscene.
Mm.
What do you think? And Jenna, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Jenna, please feel free to go first.
Sure. I think it's a very good question. So I'd like to start in a different place, if that's okay. I think something that's really interesting about Palestine, and when we talk about Al-Qadiyya al-Falastiniya, when we talk about Sha'b al-Falastini, when we talk about all of these things when it comes to Palestinians, people often say, it's not a religious issue, right? So like we hear that said all from even the best of intentions, from people with the best of intentions, they say this isn't a religious issue, it's a humanitarian issue. And the reason they say it's not a religious issue is because it's been framed, I know we'll use the word very intentionally, diabolically, as a religious issue in terms of Judaism versus Islam. Like that's the response, right? So when you think about the phrases that we use, when we say it's not a religious issue, we're saying that in relation to the idea that this is a religiously toned battle between the children of Ishmael and the children of Isaac, like this biblical Judaic, like long-term standing animosity just by the sheer sake of religion. And I would respond to that with saying that, yes, it's not a religious issue in that aspect, but from a Muslim perspective, it is a religious issue, not because it's a religious issue of Muslims versus anybody else. It's a religious issue because of what it demands from a moral perspective and what Islam commands of us to do. And so I think that's part of the framing that is very dangerous, in the Muslim sense, because I think without that nuance, without understanding that when someone says this isn't a religious issue, this is a humanitarian rights issue, it also opens the door for people to say, well, why are we always talking about Palestine? Why are we not talking about everything else? And that's often what I hear from Muslims,
Yeah.
prior to October 7th, and I've actually been very impressed with the Muslim community since October 7th, which is an unfortunate thing to say because it's a low bar, that just the sheer level of carnage that we've seen has necessitated this level of response. It's still, in my opinion, lacking in certain spaces, and I think our mosques are one of those spaces, but I think, again, that's a sliding scale of engagement. But it's very difficult as a Muslim and a Palestinian, and I said this earlier in some of our talks, as somebody who, by their sheer nature of being Palestinian, believes themselves to be, to hold on to their thread of their Islam through their Palestinianness, right? Because when I think about Palestine and when I think about Islam, for me, the most obvious connection is that both of those parts of my identity, both being Muslim and being Palestinian, necessitate a struggle against despotism. Both of them necessitate a struggle for justice. You know, when we talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and all of his names, a lot of them identify us, and, God is the source of justice, and we are asked and expected to embody godly like characteristics. And one of those things is establishing justice in this land and making it so very clear that our hearts are able to actually differentiate between what it looks like to establish justice and what it looks not to. I've been listening to Julia Botros a lot, the singer, and there's a song that it's not particularly her song, but Wen el Malayin, which translates to Where are the Millions? And the lines start with Wen el Malayin, meaning where are the millions? Wen el Arabi wen, like where are the Arabs? Wen el Shab el Arabi wen, meaning the people, like the population, the Arab, where are they? El Ghadab el Arabi wen, meaning the anger of the Arabs, where is it? And I would encourage everybody to listen to the song and find the translation, but it's very interesting to me because even through art, something that, Khaled, you're both named Khaled, so I'm going to say Professor Beydoun. One of the things Professor Beydoun said is that, he was almost formed by this war. He was raised in a time period, and when he looks at Gaza, he sees Beirut, and I think that type of imagery is so important because, when you visit musical writings, and when you visit even poets, and you visit the different spaces in which people are talking about the conflict, it's almost as though they're indistinguishable from one another, depending on the year. I wrote a poem in 2013, literally 10 years ago, and I was reading it again in 2023, and it was about Gaza, and it could have been I could have written it a month ago. And that's one of those things that's very difficult because it does then beg the question that we all know, and we've all known for a very, very long time. And our poets and our musicians and our intellectuals and, just sheer oral history has been amplifying the fact that this has been going on for so long. And so I really just regurgitate the question, الشعب العربي وين؟ الغضب العربي وين؟ الملايين وين? Like it's a question, and it's a question that deserves an answer. And it's not that I think it's not that I've lost hope in the Muslim Ummah. So like the question, this is a very long roundabout way of going back, but the question of, what is there to say about a Muslim ummah that when its people are screaming for it and it doesn't answer that call, what does it say about that Muslim ummah? And for me, what it says about this Muslim ummah is two things. One is that, people are not their governments, and there are plenty of people who are loud and, truly fearless and willing to put themselves, their voices and their bodies on the line for what is right. But it also says something, that the level of pushback is that our faith has been rebranded. Our faith in mass, the mass understanding of Islam and how it is meant to be understood and implemented. There's a level of orthopraxy and a level of orthodoxy that our faith demands of us. It demands both. And you can't be, when you lack the part of the faith that denotes action, that demands action, you've lost, in my belief, the root cause, or the root of what your faith is supposed to compel you to do. And I think our faith has been one that has been rebranded as one of pacifists, of people who are victims of circumstance, of people whose only job is to focus on their own spiritual growth, and maybe, if so, they are compelled to expand it maybe to their familial unit. But past that point, it's not one that demands anything of anybody. And we've been neutered, for lack of a better word, in that regard. And our governments know that the power of the faith, the power of Islam, when understood, is one that pushes back against injustice. And when our religious leaders are people who promote injustice, and when our governmental leaders, for lack of a better word, these tyrants, these dictators, these despots, are people who rely on upholding a system of injustice, you have to strip the religion from anything that demands of you to overthrow that injustice. You have to make it so appealing. This faith has to be so appealing and ask so little of you that to put yourself in a position that is uncomfortable, that could risk your livelihood, that could risk your social status, that could risk possibly your iqama, your residency in some of these countries that we're talking about, is one that people are not willing to do. And while I understand human, safety and the ability to care for your family, there will be no change. There will be absolutely no change until there is a mass rejection of the status quo in the way that we understand our faith. The way we currently understand our faith doesn't demand anything of us. It demands that you put a hijab on and pray and Sum Ramadan and Hajj if you get there. It doesn't demand anything else of you. And that's the fault of our religious leadership, in my opinion. That's the fault of our religious leadership in tandem with the political structures that are bolstered by that religious leadership. One cannot exist without the other. But that's my answer to that.
Khaled, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I definitely echo all the sentiments. And I also sort of want to couple it with the idea that, look, it's important to understand that this crisis is unfolding within the context and within the strategic deployment by Netanyahu of the lexicon of the war on terror, right? So in many regards, any proactive actions taken by Muslims to resist, to rebel, to challenge what's taking on in Palestine is viewed in the Western imagination through the lens of counterterrorism and Islamophobia. So it's pacified not only by this prevailing Western war on terror discourse, but it's also, I think, in many respects, enabled by whatever you want to call it, post or neo-colonial divide and conquer, where the United States and their proxies in Europe have the ability to sort of control, not only control, but to sort of puppeteer Western, Arab and Muslim governmental leaders in ways that not only pacify them into inaction, but distance them from the demands of the people. Like one thing, and there's a real dissonance going on. There's a real fracture in the Arab and Muslim societies with what the people feel and what the people want, with what the governments are doing, right? And I think that this, going back to the status of the Ummah, there is nothing more galvanizing within the broader transnational Muslim community than Palestine. Nothing, right? As a political issue and a political crisis. And the sheer severity of this genocide, I think, demonstrates just how galvanizing it's been on a grassroots level amongst Muslims everywhere. If you look at the protests in Indonesia, for instance, or the protests in Morocco, the social media, screams coming from countries around the world, the protests in places where they've never taken place before. There was a protest in Qatar, for God's sakes. I can't remember there being a protest for anything in my lifetime in Doha, right? A daily protest in Amman. You guys saw that Bissan and Mu'taz, the famous journalists on the ground, they called for a global economic shutdown on Monday. Beirut, Cairo, Amman, Marrakesh, Casablanca were entirely shut down. All the businesses were shut down. So the people's hearts are in the right place, right? Muslims globally. But the sad reality is that their governments are the neo-colonial products and puppets of Western governments that have utter and complete control over them. And we still, and Khaled, if I can say really quickly, when you went off the list of Israel's human rights violations, that's a clear demonstration that Israel has been put above the law. They can do whatever it is they want to do. And governments have been entirely, I like the word the sister used, neutered from taking any kind of action.
You know, one of the things that I really don't think that it has been appropriately or properly understood or appreciated yet is exactly the thing that you're a specialist on, and that's the role of Islamophobia. Because I see Islamophobia, I mean, even in educational institutions, and I'm really interested in your experience and Jenna's reactions as well. Yes, I know a lot of scholars, even in CRS, who intellectually understand Islamophobia is a problem. It's bigotry.
Yeah.
But when it comes to reacting to it at the same level that as a racial plight, even getting Muslims to understand the role of race in this butchery, it's quite difficult. Tied to this is if institutions properly understood Islamophobia as a racial issue, we wouldn't get some of the asinine responses from. So, for instance, I mean, and I'm curious what's going on. By the way, I don't know if I don't put it on my resume anymore because it was so long ago. But I visited. I was a lecturer at ASU law school a long time ago, back in the 80s. I don't know if you were born then, or
No, I was born then.
okay. Yeah, how 89? Well, like you're
Menin, 80.
Yeah, and 89.
Oh yeah, I was young. I was a
Okay.
kid.
Okay. So anyway, but so you have law school, you have these law firms that come in and literally is telling law students, if you open your mouth about this butchery, about undeniable, beyond dispute or argument,
Yeah.
genocide in every sense, we will take away your offers. We might even, but we have a whole bunch of professors who signed a statement saying, calling for the sanctioning of students who protest, and educational institutions do nothing, and do nothing. Even when you talk to them about, listen, these people are being butchered because their race is not considered human. and you get vacuous looks, sort of like as if. So I really, I mean, I really, can you help us understand the role of Islamophobia in this obscenity we are living through?
Yeah, it's an obscenity, and I like that word. It's also an absurdity because it exposes how Islamophobia is one of these last bastions of acceptable bigotry, even amongst progressives, even amongst individuals who would classify themselves as civil rights champions, critical race theorists who've been entirely silent. I mean, one of the hardest lessons, Professor Khaled, that I've experienced during these last 70 days is people who I really admired and looked up to as, intellectual heroes and mentors of mine who, stood up for things like racial and social justice. And I believed what they said and have been entirely silent during these 70 days. And you know many of these people that I'm talking about. And
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not gonna call
Yeah.
out their names out of respect, and they've been good to me, but it's been more than just disappointing. It's been very much a blow, a gut punch in many ways.
Yeah, yeah,
But no, I think
devastating.
it's extremely devastating because it echoes what you just said, that Arab lives, Muslim lives, Palestinian lives are low on the pecking order. That if these, and I'm gonna be honest, and people want to get mad at me, feel free to get mad at me, but if these were Black American lives, if these were Latino lives, if these were LGBTQ lives, then the uproar would be considerable. We saw what happened out of the Ukraine. If you juxtapose the Ukraine as a case study against Gaza, against Palestine, and the uproar was considerable, largely from in the mainstream, but amongst white individuals. So the fact that people of color, especially people of color within these spaces where racial justice is the currency, are entirely silent, I think just speaks volumes about how little they think about us. Not only little they think about us from the Islamophobic lens. I might get in trouble for saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think there's always been sort of a suspicion amongst leftists who discuss race on when it comes to Muslims, because we're a religious community. And there's a strong element within that space that is either sacrilegious or atheistic, and they're generally suspicious of religious movements at large, especially the ways in which Muslims are stereotyped, right? Again, through an Islamophobic lens, right? Masculine Muslim identity is stereotyped as being hyper-aggressive, violent, patriarchal, sexist, stereotypes that go against many of the cornerstone virtues that the far left holds, right? And Muslim women have been stereotyped by that very same element as, lacking agency, submissive, controlled by their husbands, oppressed, silent. And that goes against the framing or the virtues that the far left holds. So I think that also contributes. And the fourth part that I think is the most potent with kind of driving this idea that Islamophobia is the last bastion of acceptable bigotry on the right and the left, is power, right? Real politic. Going back to the question you asked before with governments, look, whether we like it or not, Jewish Americans hold considerable influence in say in institutions of power, whether that's law schools, law firms, and they can sort of, not as a collective, because no group is a monolith, right? Everybody's heterogeneous, but can exercise power in a way that suppresses the speech of individuals who are saying benign things. People are getting trouble for just sharing statistics about mass death, aren't even taking ideological positions on things, right? Not even saying provocative things, but are doing the least, doing the bare minimum, and still getting in trouble for just speaking on an issue that everybody should be speaking about.
By the way, there's a professor at UCLA, Noah Katz, who wrote an article.
Yeah.
You've seen it?
I haven't read that, but Noah's a fantastic scholar on poverty.
Yeah, and the fact that, I mean, he thinks that this is covered by Title VI, targeting Muslims, because it rests on racial assumptions. But I'm curious. I mean, as a practicing attorney, Jana, I mean, how do you? I mean, I often, I've known you for some time now, and then I try to put myself in your shoes quite often, and I can't imagine how you navigate life as a Muslim woman. I mean, I know you get it from a lot of your Arab clients who talk down to you as a woman, but then there's this whole other thing where you're, whether you like it or not, you're a walking sort of what is the word I'm looking for?
Representative, banner,
Yeah,
card-bearing member.
for it, um,
Symbol, she represents whatever you think Islam is, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm particularly lucky in the role that I occupy, at minimum, the job that I have and who I'm employed by. I'm in terms of a, public facing standpoint, the things that I say are not, you know, up for debate. I don't have to censor myself or limit myself in any sort of way from from that capacity. So I know I'm particularly lucky in that way. As for how I manage it in other spaces, I think that I've had a lot of practice for a very long time, just being visibly Muslim. That's one part of it. I think I don't actually believe in trying to hold each individual person to task on their microaggressions or their individual biases or they what they bring to a particular table. Does that make sense? So particularly with my Arab clients, if they have a frame of reference that they're operating under, and often they're double, twice my age, I'm not going to spend the time trying to deconstruct an entire philosophy. It's just, to me, it's not worth it. I think there are ignorances that are harmful and meant to harm and meant to be malicious, and then other ignorances that kind of just operate in the spaces that we.
you know what? The reason I asked this question is because from real world, a lot of my students. I mean, you've spoken in my class, so my my refugee law class knows you, and inshallah next semester I'm supposed to be teaching again, so inshallah they'll know you again, and of course they know Khaled Beydoun. Thanks to Khaled, he inspired me to teach a class on Muslims, race, and law, and I pretty much modeled it after him and used his texts and used his articles. I mean, it's basically a Khaled Beydoun class, but just you know, but the issue, the thing that comes up all the time, and this is real. I've never seen Muslim law students, even including 9/11, I've never seen them as terrified as they are now. And uh, I mean, I can't tell you how many meetings I've had. UCLA has a good number of Muslim students every year, and how many meetings I've had with my Muslim students, and the amount of anxiety is. And I can't tell you the number of times I've been asked, like, well, how do these people, you guys, they're so outspoken and yet they have a career. And I even have a few Muslim students who are in hoping, dreaming of becoming law professors someday, but they're like truly say, we don't know how Khaled Beydoun did it. It just it seems like it's impossible. It so wh- I'm sure you encounter. I mean, I should add, do you encounter students like that in Khaled in your law school? And what do you guys? What would you guys tell them? What would you advise them? I mean, is it just a shot in the dark, and whether you end up lucky or not lucky, or
Yeah, Professor Khaled, I'll tell you this. When I came to UCLA, I was like a knucklehead from Detroit. I was the first in my family to go to college and then law school. I didn't even know what I was doing. I had no clue what my professional future would look like. But I'll tell you this, and this is very true. I'm not brown nosing by any means. But when I saw people like you and Professor Crenshaw and Devin Carbato and Cheryl Harris teaching law school classes, it became real to me that it was a possibility, right? Because you guys went against every caricature that I had in my mind about who a law professor was and what a law professor looked like. And I was a student in the post 9/11 context, and I took your classes
Yeah.
in that context, and you were very vocal and courageous at that time, right? And I was like, who's this Arab Muslim law professor saying things that I wished I could say? And that was really inspiring. So the models that you guys provided to me at an early age let me know that there was a road to follow and a template to try to emulate. I think I'll say this. Devin Carbato, Professor Carbato at UCLA, who's been so generous to me in my professional development. He told me something that when I was teaching at UCLA really always stuck with me. Look, I didn't go to Harvard. I didn't go to Yale. I didn't go to an Ivy League law school. And then he told me, Khaled, you're writing about stuff that is really controversial, and a lot of people won't hire you based on who you are and what it is you're writing about. So you have to work 3 times as hard and to be as prolific, 3 times as prolific as other people. And when he said that to me, I knew that I wasn't the smartest person. I knew that I didn't have the best pedigree, but because I come from where I came from, I knew that I could outwork everybody. And that if I wrote, published, developed, a research agenda that would resonate to what was sort of addressing or resonant with the times, that I would get a job. And then when I finally got a job, I tried to, climb the ladder, if you will. And alhamdulillah, it's worked out. But that doesn't mean that I haven't experienced a lot of knocks in the roads. I'll tell you, in the past couple of years, law schools have invited me to interview with them. They pursued me and everything went really well. And I get a call at the 11th or 12th hour that I didn't get the job, and they wouldn't even share the vote with me when I'd inquire about specifics about why I didn't get the job, because everything from my vantage point went really well. And I know what it was. I know it's an article they unearthed about Palestine. I know how they read, my identity. So it's been extremely difficult. There's been blows against the road, but yani, alhamdulillah, there has been luck along the way, but more importantly than luck, I've had really generous mentors who have stuck with me.
I think that's a great point, actually. And it's the symbol. Like when people say representation doesn't mean anything, like I know why they say that sometimes, because it's more of like just having somebody who looks like you in a position of power doesn't necessarily mean top-down flow of acceptability, but there is something unbelievably powerful at minimum by seeing that there is a possibility in that space. And I think that Professor Beydoun is correct that it demands a level of excellence from you that your peers can get away with not always having, and it demands grit, and it demands pushing past those things. Because I say this to people often, sometimes my hijab enters the room before I do. You have to be smart, you have to be sharp, you have to be fast, you have to be able to do those things. And the funny thing is that people who look like us, believe like us, we do have a right to be in these spaces, but more so than that, there is a history of us in these spaces. You just have to seek it out. There's nothing inherently, you're not inherently less intelligent than your peers or inherently less qualified just because you don't have a history of attorneys in your family. I really relate to that in that way. My sister is older than me, but her and I are the first attorneys in the family. And so when you start paving that road, and then early on in your law school career, you learn very quickly that people, just by the sheer fact of having been raised around other people in this space, they have a leg up. There's jargon, there's connections, there's understandings. So finding mentorship in these spaces and recognizing the value of making those types of connections, and insisting on being in these spaces, despite the fact that they're not cut out for you. They're not made with you in mind. Not cut out for you is not the right word. They're not made for you in mind.
I have a really frank question. One of the things that I have been preaching for 30 years, not very successfully, urging, begging urging, begging Muslims to put their money where their heart is. There's no, what recently happened. I'm sure you guys heard, right? The whole stink what was it? Which law school was it? That had the money was it Penn? The withdrawal of 100.
The
You,
president of Penn resigned.
Yeah,
yep, there's $100 million gift that was also rescinded. I think
yeah,
that's.
yeah, and I'm telling you, I mean, I know from everywhere. I mean, including UCLA, of course. The reverberations of this and the fear, and so the fact is, um, is Zionists put their money where their hearts are. Do you envision a possibility that one day we can match that level? I mean, by graduating. I mean, the reason I'm just very quickly, I'll tell you this. I was invited to speak to students at the Muslim ABA, Muslim Bar Association, the Muslim section of the ABA, basically Muslim law students, and I gave a lecture basically I gave a talk basically telling them, uh, your life cannot be about just taking care of yourselves. You have to remember that you have pressing causes. You are racialized, you are subordinated, you are subjugated, you are, and your money has to be the means for your liberation. The talk didn't go very well. I mean, I would be fascinated in knowing if either of you had a talk like that went well. It didn't go well. They didn't like it. Um, and and of course, other than bruised egos, but it's not like if things are going to change, we have to match this order.
Mm. I'll say this, Khaled. I kind of view it from a different vantage point. I view it from the vantage point of not competing in this order, but changing the structure of the order itself. I think that the corporatization of American colleges and universities are endangering their very missions, right? What is the very mission of a college or university, whether in the United States, the UK, Canada, or Cairo, right? The central objective is that it is sort of a incubator of free exchange, debate, discourse, ideas, even provocative issues and ideas like this one, which, to be frank with you, isn't even that provocative because we're talking about a genocide. Even regardless of how you feel as to how the state of Palestine or Israel should look, it should be consensus. Anybody and everybody should be against what's taking place right now, which is a full-fledged genocide. So for me, I don't view it as much as sort of like competing with, the pro-Israel or the Zionist element in terms of financing and funding the university. I view it in terms of the university actually returning to its core principles of academic freedom, free speech, and again, being this isolated oasis from the rest of society where people can freely exchange ideas in a civil way, right? And I think that this current attack that is coming from pro-Israel elements is really, and I think there's going to be a reckoning, to be honest with you. I don't think this is sustainable, to be frank with you. There needs to be, I think, a retrenchment away from the corporatization of the American college and university. Mm. But I will also say this, and something that I can remember you talking about this when I was your student. Muslims have to invest. Not only they have to invest in academic departments, they have to invest in professor chairs. They have to put their money where their mouth is, not only in building masajid, but in cultivating and building institutions within gates of power. And universities and colleges are gates of power.
Absolutely. There are all these discussions now about how basically that corporatization of universities, I mean, they make their money on their investments, right? So Princeton University can easily afford to make their education free for every single student, and still have incredible amounts of profit. Now, I always understood educational institutions are are nonprofit
Yeah.
organizations. How is that consistent? But that seems like more likely that not normal common people can influence as opposed to changing the halls of power in, say, Washington, D.C. So that's actually a
Yeah.
point of hope, which is very interesting. The other thing that I actually wanted to point out, that as you were talking, to bring it back to like the role modeling of people like Dr. Khaled. I know that it was always very interesting. I mean, he was one of the very first pioneers, right? One of the few Muslims in law schools in his time. And part of what was so unique about him is that he was very unapologetically Muslim.
Mhm.
And where there, have been many Muslims that in academia that felt they needed to either pretend that they, were not Muslim, they start drinking, or they, do whatever they need to do to fill that role. But I noticed that in this moment, when people are looking at Palestinians and going, gosh, what is it that makes them hang on to their faith, when they've lost everything? Bringing that analogy to whether it's academia or whatever, it's like Islam, Muslims can find so much strength and so much ability to make change by embracing kind of the core fundamentals of whether it's justice, resistance, social justice, and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Maybe this is kind of we were talking about this the other night. There's this thing going around where the question, I guess, on TikTok is how many men think of Rome? Like, how many times a day do you think of Rome? And it's sort of a symbol for like Western hegemony and power and strength. But at the same time, how the Islamic civilization was the only one that really could defeat the Romans. It's sort of interesting analogy for our time. When you think about how is all of this going to change? How can we, and sorry, it's sort of a roundabout thing, but you see that a lot of people are very curious about Islam now,
Yeah.
because of what's happening in Palestine. And so I see that almost as a sign of, of God and change, and maybe a sign of hope. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that front, because there's so many things are changing at this moment, and we have to come back to our faith and go, okay, when things are this extreme, what is God trying to tell us? And what is it, as Muslims, what should we do?
Yeah, Jenna said something that really stuck with me when she was speaking earlier, that Islam has to be a religion of action and pro-action. The whole idea of mu'amalat, that in addition to the responsibility to, pray and fast and give zakat, that there's also the importance of taking action, especially when people are being oppressed, whether Muslim or non-Muslim. For me, Islam has always been a liberation theology that spoke to, uplifting people when they need uplifting most. One of the trippiest thing that happens to me, and look, I'm not a symbol of Islamic excellence by any stretch. I try to be, but I get DMs I try my best. I get DMs all the time from I get like 10 to 20 messages a day, random people that want a copy of the Quran, are curious about how to revert, and just say things as beautiful, simple but beautiful. I want to learn about Islam for myself. Where should I go? And we saw this to a smaller degree in the post 9/11 moment and during the Trump ban, where all this ripe Islamophobia was really pushing individuals who wanted to think for themselves, to study and closely scrutinize what Islam actually meant. And now it's happening to a scale that I think is unprecedented in my lifetime. And I think that's a beautiful thing. When I see those messages, I'm just really heartened by them. Just yesterday, I'm in Dallas and I had an event with Imam Omar Sulaiman. And a sister who was sitting in the audience decided then and there that she wanted to convert. And she came up and took the Shahada with Imam Omar. And I was sitting there and I watched it happen live, and it was beautiful.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean, sorry, go ahead. No, you're fine.
go for it, Jana.
No, nothing. I was just gonna say, I think I'm not really one of the, not one of the, I'm taking it back. I'm not really a like recruit Muslim. I don't know how else to say them. Like, like
Dawah
I'm
Muslim.
Yeah. Like I'm not really of the opinion. I really think that, but I'm always interested in trends. So I say that with a caveat. I'm very, very interested in trends, and I'm interested in how particular moments in history impact the way that our generations are uh, develop, right? So when we talk about like marks of a generation, when we talk about like what makes boomers boomers, right? Or what makes Gen Z, or what makes Gen X this, or what makes millennials act like millennials, a lot of them have to do with like the societal things that are happening around us in that particular moment in time, right? So when people talk about you know, certain age groups being far more frugal, it's because they were raised during the Depression. You know what I mean? Like there are certain things that have that type of impact on the actual social psyche of a age group of people. And I always kind of go back to what it means that people start to look into Islam. And I think it's far more interesting than just oh, let's figure out what makes these people so steadfast, or now that everyone's talking about Islam, let me just crack open a Quran. I actually think that most people are in desperate need of an ideology. Like most people are desperate to find some form of ideology, and ideology is understood through the actions of the people who exhibit it, not so much the actual textual application. So that's what I think is particularly interesting, because, post 9/11, when people were looking into it, I'm not entirely sure if it was due to the fact that people were talking about Islam so much, or due to the response from Muslims, or due to, you know what I'm saying? I'm not entirely sure what spurred that interest, but I think it's far easier to understand right at this very moment. The rise in Islamophobia in 2001 was it was like a slow burn up until that point. If you even look at the movies like Back to the Future, prior to, like, I remember so vividly watching Back to the Future, and the terrorist at the beginning of the thing was like a Libyan, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, I remember so vividly, and that's clearly a movie from the 80s, if I'm not mistaken. So that was pre all of this. So there's always kind of this understanding in popular culture of the dehumanization of the brown man generally, but particularly the other, living in a Judeo-Christian society, and like being easily able to identify the other in that particular way, especially because oil interests have gone far back, like way further back than 2001. So you have to lay the groundwork. But I think keep going on these tangents. But I think that really the interesting part about it is the fact that people are desperate for ideologies, and you find that based on how quickly people dive in to an understanding that seems cohesive. So if the message of Islam that people are seeing from people in Gaza, because it's interesting, right? Gaza is not only made up of Muslimin. They have the oldest Christian population in Gaza. We have churches. There was, reports today. I found out there was a Catholic church in Gaza today because people were sheltering in a Catholic church. So you know what I'm saying? Like, there's a very
My friend's family are in there. Fifi Saba,
Yeah.
I spoke to her on IG Live today.
Wow.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what I mean. It's a rich cultural space. So then the question is that what is the ideology top to bottom? And then what does that say about the ideology of religion? What is religion supposed to do? Religion is supposed to offer some form of answer, right? And so when all we have right now is questions. How is this happening? How are people letting this happen? And how are people surviving this? And all signs keep pointing towards, I don't know if it's rightfully or wrongfully, right? Because I think what keeps Palestinians strong is not just Islam. I think it has to do with being a constant state of knowing who your oppressor is, being able to point the finger at your oppressor, and therefore having a concerted target in terms of who you're resisting against. But I think it's interesting because I think people want answers. And right now, there's a lot of Muslims who are being really loud, telling them that Islam is the answer. And I think sometimes correlation versus causation, like, I'm wondering where those two work in that space. But I think it's an opportunity. That's to wrap it up. I think it's an opportunity for Muslims to make it very clear that our faith is not one of pettiness. So much of how we've been talking about our faith in the overarching space has been one of rules for the sake of rules, not wisdom behind an understanding of why we do the things that we do. And I think this is a moment in time in which Muslims can prove that our faith is one that is so unbelievably rich, that it has something to teach even those who do not choose to follow it. Because I don't think the goal at the end of the day is to make sure everyone Muslim. is Muslim. The goal at the end of today, or at the end of the day, is to ensure that Muslims are an example of what it looks like to elevate and be dignified and teach other people how to be dignified in that way. All we have at the end of our day, the end of the day, is our dignity. And we need to ensure that we, hafiz alayha, or yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that this is such an opportunity. And it's so interesting. Like, I was just listening to this conversation today between a father who's a writer and his son who's 18. And, we do hear these conversations, Baba and Mito, Baba and Sharif. And it was really fascinating for me to hear this conversation, two very, very smart people. And the son was 18 and thinking, asking questions that had to do with meaning of life and purpose. And, they very at the outset said, well, this society has basically set aside religion. So it was already a foregone conclusion that religion is not even something that we should consider as a means of finding, any kind of cohesive ideology that could guide us to something elevated. But then the conversation went from there to talk about how important it is to feel you have a meaning and a purpose and that you should be elevated. And so it's almost like, you had the telltale signs of it without the substance. And I felt like, if they could hear the conversation between Dr. Khaled and our son Mito or our son Sharif, here's what the conversation looks like when you actually have a very vibrant, rich, foundation, like anchoring in a belief in God and a full methodology. Even these are things that a lot of our fellow co-religionists have lost because, as we've seen in our journey with the tafsir and trying to tell people we're doing the tafsir, even Muslims themselves glaze over. They're like, oh, that's nice. It's probably like every other tafsir that we've heard, and it doesn't light anything in us. There's nothing that the Quran has to say to us in our time. We found that absolutely to be completely, wrong through our journey. But, so it's an opportunity. I mean, I keep seeing this. It's like people are searching, like you said, they're searching for what is the meaning of all of this, especially when we're seeing such extremity of behavior before our eyes. You can't help but question, is this the end of times between climate change, between genocide, between, what's happening with oligarchy and the people in power? And, you can have the entire world on the other side of genocide and it still makes no difference. But for us as Muslims, it feels, especially for us in our space, trying to teach people critical Islam, trying to teach people, the Quran, teaching us, people ethical Islam. This is a time for us to,
for us, I mean, we try to return the Quran to its proper place in Muslim life, because whether Muslims realize it or not, they've really marginalized the Quran completely, and it's the power of its message. But for, and again, again, I mean, I don't think people. I still don't think Muslims realize how old and how historically embedded Islamophobia is, and how understudied Islamophobia is. And so the studies, because you're a pioneer in coming in this in critical legal studies generally, in the same way the critical legal studies initially had ignored race, and so critical race studies was born. Well, critical race studies has ignored Islam and the racialization of Muslims.
Yeah.
And so, and you've come in and you've tried. It blows my mind that we don't have institutions and institutes and fellowships and scholarships and available for. So, and I know that you've tried to build something to focus on the study of Islamophobia, but I don't know the details. I've heard that there was some setback that you suffered, and which really, I mean, really disturbed me. Just even without knowing the details, it's like, what the hell is wrong with the world? If we need anything, we need money that is dedicated to the study of Islamophobia.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, I'll
So
say
I
this.
mean, I don't know if you feel like you could share what happened.
I can generally look. I'll say this: like it's kind of like a catch-22 with critical race theory. Look, I'm a critical race theorist. You know that, Khaled.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
came out
yeah,
of that program. I chose to go to UCLA because of the program. You know, because you know my one of Kim Crenshaw is my primary mentor. I love Kim to
yeah.
death, and I owe so much of my success to Kim. And so Kim is, even though she doesn't speak on Islamophobia, is instrumental in me building a sort of footprint within legal academia on Islamophobia. So I give her credit, and I give critical race theory credit. I mean, credit for taking me in and giving me the fellowship and helping me build my career. But you're right. I think that there is an aversion because of the things that I mentioned earlier. And also Islamophobia. I mean, you know this, Khaled. You know, one of my heroes is Edward Said. And so Islamophobia is an emanation of Orientalism and the study that he
Yeah.
did with the comparative literature in media space, right? I took much of what he did and applied it to the legal context after the war on terror. I think that, yeah, there isn't an appetite to sort of invest in it, largely because it is both racial and religious animus. Right, it's not, and it sort of it rejects much of the key concepts that critical race that isn't central to critical race theory, but are sort of adjacent to critical race theory. When Jana was talking about, and I want to tie what Jana was sort of alluding to that stuck with me to respond to your question more explicitly. Islam is an antidote at a time in the United States when a secular society is devolving into a godless society. Right. And I think it was Nietzsche who said that when God is missing from society, individuals develop and think of themselves as their own gods. That's why we're seeing a lot of sort of social and political stances and issues become emergent, because you can essentially become a being of your own making if there is no sort of divine constraints stifling your ability to change your race, change your gender, whatever it might be. Right. So even and when you merge capitalism with godlessness, right, that's a recipe and a road towards nihilism. So even the wealthiest people in this country, the most successful people with the most successful careers, eventually become isolated, unsatisfied, and alone when they lack some sort of spiritual context, or more important, spiritual community. Right, community, something as tangible as having loved ones and friends around you. And look, the West and the United States can be a brutally lonely place if you don't have loved ones around you, if you're just tethered to your career, and you don't have, faith trying to, make sense of what everything means. So Islam, I think, is a really appealing because it fills many voids for people who are stuck in that circumstance. And in addition, and when you tie in Gaza to that, right? Look at Gaza. Look at the principal sort of like archetypes of Gaza. People like young Mu'taz, probably the most celebrated citizen journalist in Gaza, like the young woman Bassam, like Wael Dahdouh, the journalist whose wife was killed and kids were killed, and yesterday he was shot. And you would think this guy's world would be destroyed, but the next day he wakes up, goes back to work because he believes in Allah, because for him, he's living for a greater purpose. So if you juxtapose the American experience of material extravagance, right, in godlessness, with people in Gaza in real time right now who have nothing. They have nothing in terms of material wealth, but they have spiritual wealth. And they're moments, during these stops, they're singing with one another. They're playing with cats. They're smiling, right? And Americans see that, especially young Americans see that on their digital timelines, and they revere that. They want that. How can these young people who have nothing and have death surrounding them and death waiting for them at every stop find it in their day to continue on with their jobs when their wife and children have been killed? How can they smile and play with cats, and sing songs with one another when they're in the midst of a live genocide? Because they believe in God. These people are unhappy in the United States, living in mansions, driving nice cars, and having the most lavish careers. And we're worried about losing our jobs, for God's sakes, and we're still unhappy. These people have lost everything that they still find time, an hour every day to smile and be joyful. So I say that as pretext to say, look, I mean, Khaled, you know me really well. Grace, you know me as well. I've broken my back to where I got to in my career, and alhamdulillah, I've gone to a point where, I could request that a university support me with building a center around my research. And one of the preconditions when I came to ASU, I just started the job. I'm on sabbatical now, but this is the first year of my job, was that you support me with building a center. I got a lot of donors for the center. And as soon as I started speaking out on this issue, people pulled their money, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it was an attempt to silence me, right? I mean, obviously attempts to silence come in a range of ways. And when that money started being pulled, I had to look in the mirror and say, hey, Khaled, are you going to shut up? And sort of like, do the dance. So this money stays and you can get more money from institutions, or are you going to speak on an issue that you feel strongly about, and that you see people risking their lives on a daily basis, losing far more than hundreds of thousands of dollars, risking their lives. So I had no choice. And yeah, I lost a lot of money. I don't know where the center is going. Inshallah, I can raise more funds. But to me, to be frank with you, that isn't a concern right now.
I mean, for whatever, if for whatever it's worth, if there are any wealthy Muslims out there, please, there is nothing more worthy that you can do with your money than support the study of the evil of Islamophobia. And this is the preeminent scholar on the topic. You're not going to get someone more distinguished or more established than that. So please, for whatever it's worth.
No, thank you, Khaled. That means a lot from you to say that. Yeah, I mean, you're somebody I've admired my entire life. So thank you for saying that.
Well, I know we have about 7 minutes left.
I can stay a little longer. No, we can continue for another 20 minutes. It's fine.
Great. Go ahead.
No, I was just I was going to tell you just I've noticed I've noticed some comments on the chat, and I don't know what they're saying, but just
Okay, so this is one question that we have. We are protesting, boycotting, and exposing the truth, but the escalating genocide in Gaza shows little improvement. Unfortunately, we can no longer rely on the United States for support. How can we collectively demand a ceasefire?
I've been talking a lot, Jenna. I'm going to defer to you.
Well, you had a lot of good to say, so I was hoping you would actually take that one. How can we collectively demand a ceasefire? I think that's a good question. See, I've been working through this a lot mentally because, it's obvious that the tone of the Biden administration is shifting. And it's obviously shifting, in my opinion, and many people who are much smarter than me, I think, have pointed to the same thing at this point, that, if you look at the history of Israel's campaigns in Gaza, everything kind of stops around a 3-week timeline. Operation Cast Lead is 21 days. You have different things. So it's almost as though there's kind of a metric as to what Israel and the United States tend to deem acceptable or that they can get away with. And then there's some new pause. There's a Qatar exchange, or like there's a Qatar deal to pause, or something that's figured out with Muslim or things, or Egypt and stuff like that. So I think there's a miscalculation. We've been talking about this a lot. There was a miscalculation on behalf of the Biden administration. And the Biden administration probably did not think that this was going to go on for 70 days. I don't think that they did. I think if they had thrown all of because that's what they did, right? So the stance of the United States is always unbelievably clear. It's always one of unequivocal support for Israel. We are going to constantly support Israel. And so they started off on that they started off in the same vein that they always do. Little did the United States know that Israel was not going to be leashed this time around. And I think that there was going to be no leash from Israel in this time around because of the scale of the security breach on October 7th. And so whether or not the Biden administration was fully aware of the fact that their blank check endorsement of the Israeli regime, especially at the hands of Netanyahu, was going to result in this much carnage, the tone is shifting now from the Biden administration, almost of one that is, I think I would say around 15 days in, it was very clear that, Israel has a right to defend itself, to protect its borders, to do all of these types of things. And now at day 70, you're hearing from the Biden administration, well, the use of the word indiscriminate bombing, like that's a very different shift. And so if the question is, how can we demand the ceasefire? I think everything that we're doing now is demanding the ceasefire. I think it's continued direct action, it's continued vocalization, it's continued posting about it. Just because we start to see shift in the tone of the administration, the shift is happening right around the time that people are starting to campaign. There's a real understanding that this is a point of no return for a lot of people, and people are not going to vote this administration back in. And I think they know that. And there's a lot of attempt now to make people who are being vocal about not wanting to vote for this administration feel as though they're going to be responsible for an inevitable Trump administration. And I think what we can do as a collective is to reject those types of arguments and continue applying the same amount of pressure, because whether or not the United States ever chooses to be on the right side of history should have no bearing on the continued effort that you do. The same way when people ask about why are we still having a UN vote, right? Why are we still calling these votes at the UN if you know that the United States is going to veto it? And you have a lot of people who just continuously say these things are useless. The UN is useless. None of these things matter. The United States is going to veto it anyway. It matters for the course of history. It matters that these types of things are taken to a vote. It matters that there was dissent on the record in these types of spaces, because the United States, at the end of the day, is a system that relies on its populace, despite the fact that it intends to separate itself from its populace, you know what I'm saying? And making sure that big businesses and companies and lobby groups have far more say than the average American person. But at the end of the day, that's not sustainable. We know that that's not sustainable. And that what 4 years of a Trump presidency did to the United States, whether or not they realize that you can't just bully people into blue no matter who. You can't bully them anymore into doing that. I think there's a very real fear. So I don't exactly know if the populace can get us to a ceasefire, right? But I know that the populace can push and continue to apply pressure in this way, because all empires, and make no mistake, the United States is an empire, all empires have an inevitable turning point. And I'm not, asking for, the end of the fall of Rome in the same way that I'm, expecting these types of things. But there has to be a critical turning point in the general population. Doesn't need to happen at the end of the day. If the general population finds itself,
Jana,
sorry, I'm not sure if I cut off.
Just if you could go back for 1 minute, because I think you started getting cut out. If you could just make your last point again.
Well, yeah, the last point that I wanted to make was that I was saying that what we need to level set our expectations as a group. We're never going to be in a space in which every single person in the United States is pro-Palestinian. We just need to make sure that the American population isn't so invested in Israel. That's really where the shift needs to come. Being pro-Palestinian is very important for those who are pro-Palestinian, but for the vast majority of people in this country, getting them in a particularly individualistic society to care about the collective, the global collective, is a very tall task and a very far-reaching task. But if you can make the American conscience understand that supporting Israel is far more detrimental to the American conscience, the American politic, to the American status across the world, which is what the UN votes do, which is how it shows that the United States is increasingly isolated. That is the type of pressure that is going to actually have an impact in this type of way. So, you know, what can you do? You can do exactly what you're doing now because it's important. It's the reason people are being stifled. It's the reason people are losing their jobs. It's the reason people like Professor Beydoun, who should have a center at this point with no question, is having money pulled. It's because the greatest threat to Israel is the voice of a conscious individual. It's the greatest threat. So you just continue doing exactly what you're doing. And, you know, 75 years is not a long time for a state. Its cracks are showing.
I want to ask you a question. There was a very thoughtful article today on a Substack by Hamilton Nolan that put out the possibility that if Rashida Tlaib ran for president, that this would be like a good tool for negotiation, and a way for her to be like, you know, it would be shape and form for all of this frustration and, you know, resistance to get behind someone like that. And the point of it would be not necessarily that she was trying to win to become president, but that she could make a difference in the swing states where Biden would really hurt. And in order to collect, you know, a critical mass of people, I mean, you know, even if we're talking about 5 percentage points, to then at that point say, okay, here's what I want. Because we don't have the opportunity to even at this point have a primary, you know, like there was a discussion about how Bernie was able to make progress because there was, you know, some debate, there was some negotiation happening. All of that has been silenced because everyone has gotten behind Biden. But so now we're in the situation where, okay, you either have Biden or Trump. Those are the two choices. But even so that you could push Biden closer on certain things we care about, you know, Rashida Tlaib could be that person that could get enough support to elicit some kind of negotiation to take place that would help the Palestinians. I'm just wondering, I know you're from Detroit, and you know, I'm wondering if you might have any thoughts on that. It was a really interesting article on Substack.
Yeah, you know, I got to read the article. Hamilton Nolan.
Yes. And he actually is a writer about unions and labor. So it was very much like, this is how unions and labor movements negotiate. It was very thoughtful, I thought.
Yeah, you know, Rashida's a friend of mine. Her and I work together in the community.
Tell her.
Yeah, Rashida's tough. I love Rashida to death. And look, I think that Michigan is a swing state. And Michigan is home to one of the most concentrated, politically vocal and visible Muslim communities in the United States. So having Rashida as an archetype that's able to sort of mobilize the Muslim vote, and the Muslim vote can be very instrumental and impactful on a national level to vote in one way, I think can sway this coming election. Look, my position is I can't vote for Biden. I don't care if Shaitan is running against him, and Trump is close to Shaitan, but you know, I mean, voting for somebody who has not only enabled and financed the genocide, but has been a full-fledged co-conspirator in a genocide. Look, I'm 40-some years old, and I haven't experienced or seen any issue as gruesome and brutal as this one. And I've studied the Uyghur Muslim genocide. I've studied Bosnia. I've studied Rwanda. I know what happened in East Timor, Iraq. Iraq might have been just as brutal, like 1 million people died, but we didn't have direct access and transparency in the way that we do now with social media. So I can never vote for Biden, right? I don't know that I could vote for Trump. So getting behind a third candidate of some kind makes a lot of sense. And I think a Rashida Tlaib would be a shock to the conscience that would scare a lot of people and mobilize a lot of people to have to rethink what a negotiation looks like with the Palestinian people, and her being Palestinian and vocally Palestinian, and as you guys saw weeks ago, being censored for saying rather benign things about the genocide, I think would be a very powerful symbol that would move people in a positive way, but also a negative way, to make this issue a discussion point that is focal in the presidential election.
Absolutely. And I think that she would get traction. I mean, everyone knows who she is. So, you know, there are other people who are running, you know, that have been
Cornel West.
Cornel West, and then even the person, what's his name? Shank.
Vancouver.
Yeah, and or RFK, who's very pro-Israel, Marianne Williamson. I mean, none of these people, I think, have any possibility. But so, I mean, I don't know. This is for political scientists to figure out. But I feel like Rashida, could be a really important symbol for just no way. We are not. I don't care. You're right. There's no way I'm voting for Biden. I mean, I don't, after the genocide, I'd rather, yeah, I mean, I can't say I'd vote for Trump, but, maybe I would sit out. But so then you've got this critical mass of people that are just sitting out and they're looking for a way to make a statement. And what greater statement than Rashida? So
Well, remember the 1992 presidential race when Ross Perot ran, and he really rose to the fore. And that was the last time in my recollection where a third party candidate was viable, right? And I think there's going to be so much disaffection and frustration with Biden from the left and the progressive left especially. And Trump obviously is really polarizing. And this sort of like landscape creates an opportunity for the emergence of a third party candidate, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And especially in these swing states, and that even if your point is just to make a statement, that is extremely effective. But if you can take it all the way, why not?
Yeah.
I just noticed, I spotted in the comments a question, because there are a lot of times a question about Article 99 of the UN Charter. Just very quickly, the short answer is Article 99 can only be effective if the superpowers are willing to allow it to be effective. All Article 99 does is that the Secretary General, on his own initiative or on her own initiative, whether can raise an issue that, if it's a breach to international peace, and demand a meeting of the Security Council to deal with a threat to international peace. But it provides no way of getting over the American veto.
Yeah.
It's not like a magic potion where the Secretary General can somehow sideline the U.S. and that's a problem. The U.S. Protects Israel in a criminal fashion. So don't get distracted with. I mean, it's helpful in the same way that Jana outlined, that the Secretary General insists that we talk about this and sort of confronts the U.S. with its crimes, but it's not going to somehow bring a ceasefire. And I don't know if well, anyway, did you notice there's always the similar question of, well, if Israelis are withdrawing their money and holding so many institutions hostage, effectively, so the question is, well, where is the Arab money? Why isn't Qatar stepping in? Or, do either of you want to take this?
Professor Beydoun?
I want to be very brief and address like the invocation of Article 99. I think it was last week. Right. Look, I'll say this. I think the indictments that the United Nations hasn't been effective are unfair, because the Secretary General Gutierrez, I think from Portugal, I think he's done an effective job, like highlighting the humanitarian concern in Gaza. And it was the first time Article 99 was invoked under his tenure. And you're exactly right, Khaled. The United States exercised its veto, but I got an interesting theory, I think, that the UN General Assembly vote has changed the landscape, right? It was a referendum against the United States and Israel, the way the vote went,
Yeah,
153 to
it's
10.
true.
And I think so. I think a further way in which the UN can sort of like Gutierrez can sort of further isolate the United States is to re-invoke Article 99 and to put the ceasefire back up for a vote amongst the Security Council. And I think that would put the United States in a corner that if it vetoed the vote again, it would be hyper isolated and be viewed as a pariah state amongst many nations around the world.
That's true. Yeah, I agree with that. Absolutely.
The
I
question
I
about the Arab
really,
money,
yeah, yeah,
that's a harder one. They're buying a lot of Cadillacs and
yeah.
Range Rovers.
Yeah,
I'd like to
yeah,
share.
yeah, I'm holding back my tongue because as you guys know, oh my God.
I'd like to share this one question because I think uh, it brings us kind of back to some of the things that we talked about in the tafsir, and also well, let me read it. So, one irony of fighting and opposing the Zionist movement in this particular moment is that it has awakened in myself and many of my Arab and Muslim friends and classmates here in the West a need and a desire for a safe haven to exist in and assert our dignity and rights, because we've been hopelessly disillusioned and alienated from our Western and American identities. I don't know how to phrase this question, but should we nourish and cultivate that feeling? What do we do to ensure that our people live, survive, and thrive as we face so many challenges, from the genocide in Gaza to the present and exacerbating climate catastrophe that our people will bear the brunt of? I'm also well aware of the dangers of nationalistic instincts and worry about the pitfalls that we may encounter. I mean, it's kind of like you've talked about this, Dr. Khaled, in a sense of, a caliphate, but I mean, that's a very, obviously triggering word. But I think the idea is kind of returning to our roots, returning to our center, which is really the Quran, and finding, a safe haven and it's not a physical thing, but it's kind of a moral and ethical thing. I'd like to ask you to answer that question, because I think that this sort of calls for a sheikh to give us
Me?
comfort and guidance. I mean, yeah, if we had the ability to have,
You know, I'm not okay. I'm I for a long time was a critic, but a believing critic in the current international order. In other words, I thought, uh, compared to compared to the alternatives, it works. It has a lot of faults, a lot of problems, but more or less, when all is said and done, it works. I think it's I mean, if and this is, I'm not talking about the average um, Muslim student in college. I'm talking about thinking ideologically about our interaction with this world. Uh, I really increasingly, and I'm gonna, you know, I think in the same way that there is symbolically a safe haven for Catholics in Vatican City, and we need a symbolic safe haven where being Muslim is enough to have full security, full on. But here is the thing, and this doesn't represent either, because I don't want to get anyone into this, doesn't represent Professor Baidoun or attorney in law, Jana Al-Akhras. But I don't think it's possible as until Mecca and Medina are liberated. I wholeheartedly believe in the imperative of liberating Mecca and Medina because Mecca and the Hijaz, the fate of the Hijaz was decided in a thoroughly colonial, but for British air power that mowed down the Ikhwan fighting force, and unrelated to the Muslim Brotherhood. This is the Ikhwan of the Wahhabi movement. Hijaz would have never become the possession of Al Saud. And Al Saud have shown all their cards and taken off every mask. Their relationship to Islam is opportunistic at best. And if I would be writing a philosophical philosophical treatise about what Muslims ought to work for, it's not just the liberation of Palestine, but liberation of Palestine absolutely is a must. And I'm not talking about that, doesn't mean so no one, I'm not talking about killing Jews or massacring Israelis. Liberation of Palestine meaning a country that can be shared by both Israelis and Palestinians with equal rights in a democratic order. Mecca and Medina cannot be the playground of a tyrannical, despotic family with a horrible record. It must be, again, democratically ruled by Muslims in an elective body and in a participatory, fully communitarian fashion. Anyway, that's. But again, I underscore this does not represent the views of anyone present here. This is just me, and if you want to, be angry at me, no one else.
Thank you. Sorry to put you in that uncomfortable.
Yeah, thank you for that.
But, I have to call attention to, I think, all of the really important work that you've done and that you've shared, here in this space, because to me, so much of what, is empowering and liberating and elevating for us as a community is what you shared in your lifelong journey with the Quran, and uncovered things that, brought the Quran to life in a way that.
But the question asks, a more practical question about safe spaces as an alien, and this is exactly, by the way, I mean, I didn't mean to cut you off about the Quran because, of course, but it's just Khaled Beydoun, I think, has dedicated his career to writing about alienated citizenry. That's the plight of the subordinated, racialized individual. And Jana has had to negotiate it professionally throughout her life. So I'm really interested in hearing what they have to say instead of my grand theorizing about the fate of Mecca and Medina, which I don't think is going to happen in our lifetime.
Jenna, go ahead.
The need and desire for us, I'm reading that. I'm actually reading the question because I want to give it the attention that it deserves. I think it's a fair ask. What it means to seek a safe haven to exist in. I mean, I'm not entirely sure if the question is do we create that system here? Do we go elsewhere to find it? I'm actually not entirely sure where the motivation of the question is in that way, because I've heard a lot of people talk about us returning to our roots, and what that means is some sort of like mass exodus back to whatever that it is. But the reality is so many of us were, I'm Palestinian, but I'm as American as I am Palestinian. I was born and raised here. This is my country as much as it is anybody else's. And I think in that sense, we have an opportunity and an obligation to make those safe spaces here, It means creating those types of communities that we want to see, and pulling from the resources that we have in order to make that a reality. Now, what that looks like is, insisting on a type of system that you can function in as a useful member of that society. We have all that we need amongst us. And when I say a society that's safe and clear for us, I don't think that it's an exclusive ethno group or exclusive religious group that's creating that type of society. If Palestinian activism has taught me anything, it's that some of the most principled and incredible individuals are not always Arab, are not always Muslim, and are not always Palestinian. What unites a people and makes them feel safe and seen and understood is a insistence on a type of morality that supersedes and transcends all of that. So maybe it's a simple answer, but for me, it's just, you don't just have community overnight. It's an intentional act. Making community, connecting with people, utilizing your skills, because everybody has them, and pouring them back into your community and your subset. Something that Professor Beydoun said earlier that I thought was really interesting about loneliness in the United States understanding of individualism is that this country is built on individualism. This country is built on these capitalistic ideologies that the only way in order to feel special is to be better. The only way to feel important is to be elevated above others. And so much of what we're looking for is a communal type of living. And I'm not saying going to a compound and living with each other and living off the land. I mean a type of communal living in which you can rely on the person next to you. And that comes with cultivating your internal empathy and pouring back into your spaces. I think it's a shift of mind. I think it's a mind shift, and it's an insistence on community. And you can find those spaces, but you have to build a lot more often than not. You have to build them, and that's the hard part of it.
Yeah, I think if you don't want your people to be dehumanized, you can't dehumanize another people as well. And to raise up a point is that we can also have a tendency to dehumanize, who pro-Israel folk are, who Zionists are, who Israelis are, and again, I'm gonna raise up his name, but Edward Said has always been my hero, and he wrote about how perpetually feeling out of place can be sort of a perspective of power. So I've always found it for me, even though it's harder for other people to have difficult conversations with individuals who are ideological adversaries. And during these 2 months, I've had difficult conversations with Zionists, individuals who are staunchly committed to the Israeli project in some form, right, across the political spectrum, whether hardline or progressive, whatever you want to label them. And as a Muslim, I have no choice but to believe that the vast majority of people are good people, regardless of what they believe and regardless of what kind of monstrosities they might support superficially. And I've seen a lot of beauty over these last 70 days, to be honest with you. Individuals, for instance, who would qualify themselves as Zionists, who have shifted on the issue, who've attended protests, who have donated to humanitarian causes. And I think that a lot of that shift comes from them and other people having difficult conversations, and people on the other, whatever the other side is, however you want to define it, not viewing them through the lens of inhumanity or as monolithic sort of beings. And I think that's really important to maintain that human sort of impulse during moments like this, especially for us, because we're not in Gaza, we're not in the region, our bodies are not on the line. Right. So we're always occupying these positions of privilege where we cannot be made irrational by living in an entirely absurd apocalyptic context. We live in comfort here. Right. So we should at minimum attempt to have civil exchanges with those who, we disagree with vehemently, because people can change. I truly believe that. It might be naive and trite to say, but I've seen it with my own eyes in these last 70 days. And that really fuels me. A second thing is what Jana said. Yeah, I'm as much a Detroiter as I am Arab, Lebanese, Egyptian, whatever it might be. This country's my own, and I'm sick of being on the defensive. right? So even though some people might want to aspire towards, a practical realization of a Muslim Ummah community, I also don't want them to forget about pushing this country on its key virtues, right? If you truly believe in the First Amendment and the free exercise of religion clause, if that is a central constitutional cornerstone of this country, then extend it to everybody and anybody, not selectively in ways that align with your interests. Live by your constitutional promises, not as merely aspirations, but as things that you should try to embody every single day. And I push people on that level, right? To be proactive. Another thing, one thing that Khaled, you talk about Islamophobia, and a tentacle of Islamophobia that really bothers me, and we see it through the propaganda that the Israeli military is pushing when they strip down these Palestinian men to fully emasculate them, right? I think there's a project to emasculate Muslim masculinity in ways that are destructive. And we see it with Black masculinity. We see it with Latino masculinity, right? The American mainstream is only comfortable with masculinity of color that is nonviolent and passive to them. And there's reasons why they push propaganda like the stripping down of these Palestinian men and parade them around as, like they were cattle across the streets of northern Gaza. For me, I think this is an important moment where Muslim men are assert and are comfortable with their masculinity and try to embody that. And I've tried to do that in ways that, look, I've gotten death threats on a daily basis, every day. I've had my family members were sent text messages threatening them. Something as frightening as this happened 3 weeks ago. Somebody took a photo of the entryway of my building and said, we know where you are, be careful. And that really shook me. But then I decided that, hey, I'm going to be proactive. And I hired some private investigators, found out who these people were, found out where they worked, found out where they lived. And I sent complaints and I sued these people and got some settlements. And 2 of these people actually who were pro-Israeli, I pushed them to donate to Palestinian causes. And if they didn't donate to those Palestinian causes, I was going to unveil where they lived. One of them was a real estate agent whose public profile mattered considerably for his business. So I'm very keen right now to not only be reactive and defensive, but to take proactive means in not only defending myself and my family, but my community.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that is really. I should learn. I should follow your example. That's I haven't thought of doing that, but that's brilliant. Yeah.
But we had a lot of that after 9/11.
Yeah, I remember Khaled's office was walled off, and
yeah,
it was
so I'm so sorry, because that is such a just destabilizing feeling when you don't know, you don't feel safe anywhere. So we've been there. We know what that feels like, and may God protect you and empower you. Well, we're reaching the 9 o'clock hour. I know we had said we were not going to go to 2 hours, but we're really grateful for your time. This has been a tremendous conversation. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to everything. I just wanted to, my job is sort of the cheerleader and the marketer. So I just have to make my final push. On this question about safety, a lot of what we're teaching through the tafsir and, through the different things that we've done is a focus on finding that safety really wherever you are. In your relationship with God and the faith in this, and the version that we're teaching is exactly as Khaled and Jana have said, is liberation, empowerment, justice oriented Islam. We get messages every day from people who are losing their faith. They're having crises of faith. They feel disconnected from the community for a lot of different reasons. And we always counsel, go back to the Quran, go back to the tafsir, go back to, take a look at some of the things that we're doing here. We have a couple of books that we've published now, The Prophet's Pulpit, which are some of Sheikh's very powerful khutbahs turned into short essays that are extremely moving and demonstrate what it means to be an ethical Muslim in our time. We're happy to send anyone a gift copy if anyone wants one. Email us, send us your address. We can do that. It's a good starting point, especially, and also, Khaled, if you're getting a lot of, inquiries about where do I learn about Islam, what we're trying to teach people is a very active, vibrant, social justice oriented Islam, but it's all grounded in the Quran. And having gone through that journey for 3 years, seeing what, Dr. Khaled shared with us, Jana went through that whole journey with us as well. It's extremely empowering and liberating. And I think that's where it's going to come. It doesn't matter where you are physically. It matters where you are, with yourself and your own empowerment, your own exceptional, talent. Because I believe that if we all have the confidence and the liberation and the empowerment to make a change, we will. And that's where it's going to come. It's going to have to come from everywhere, not just from any one particular space. But we have to have the right priorities too. And so much of that is tied into Mecca, Medina, Palestine. And even the work that Sheikh has shared with us re-emphasizes why those 3 places are particularly critical for us as Muslims specifically. Mm-hmm. So anyway, thank you so much, everyone. This has been so tremendous. And I know from the messages we've received, it's been valuable, especially in this time, for us to gather. And so I hope we can do this again sometime in the future. But thank you
In
for
person, inshallah.
Can I put just a quick plug, please? I know that some Muslims are scared of books by academics, but do yourself a favor and read Professor Khaled Beydoun's books, either his first book about Islamophobia or his most recent book. His writing is smooth, effortless, not stuffy and complicated. Is highly accessible, and you will learn a great deal. So please buy yourself a copy and buy your children a copy, because your children need to learn about this. That's just my 2 cents.
Absolutely. And next time, yes, please, Khaled, come in person and we'll
I would
do
love that.
part 2 of this conversation, inshallah. And, inshallah, may there be better days ahead. And thank you for actually both you and Jana are doing tremendous work, keeping us abreast of what's happening and keeping up the good fight, being incredible role models for those of us who feel so helpless at times. So thank you, and may God protect you, and everyone have a wonderful rest of the year. I guess we're at the end of the year, and inshallah we'll hope to gather again soon. So
no, and let me close by saying, Sister Grace, thank you so much for the work that you do, and Professor Khaled, the really pioneering work you do, and Jenna, sister, however I can be of help to you and all of you, please reach out to me. And I would love to do this in person, inshallah, for a part 2.
Sure.
And you hang on for a second, live stream, and then we can also connect. Okay, thank you everybody for joining us, and assalamu alaikum. We hope to see you.